think we'll go straight to acknowledgement of country because we've got great here and I really don't want to spend too much time on the admin side. So if we could go straight to acknowledgement of country, and over to you, Anna.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to acknowledge today that regardless of where you are in Australia, this meeting is being held on traditional and sacred land. Florence, who's Nicholas's beautiful 9-year-old daughter, is going to present the acknowledgement of country for us.
I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and future, for they hold the memories, traditions, culture and hopes for Indigenous Australia. Today we stand on the Union Bay land.
Thanks, Florence. So we've got a really diverse range of speakers today in the sense that modern slavery is very much at the core of what they are doing, but the way that they're kind of addressing it within their own industries is very unique. So we've got Elaine, who is a senior leader of legal.
And I think you've just muted yourself accidentally. Sorry, a couple of technical issues. I think Microsoft might be. There we go. Better. Perfect.
Can you hear me now? No?
All good, Anna. Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Country then, I'm assuming, or you could hear that?
No, we heard the acknowledgement of country. Thank you. Just after that, you dropped into mute.
Okay. So today we've got quite a diverse range of speakers in the sense that modern slavery is very much at the core of what they're doing, but in their own industries, they're addressing it all in very different ways. So we've got Elaine, who should be joining us first. She's a senior leader of legal and governance, sustainability and human rights at the Benevolent Society. James, who is a professor of global politics and anti-slavery at Nottingham University, and Todd, who is the director of business and government engagement in the modern slavery and human trafficking branch at the Australian Border Force. So Elaine, I'll stop sharing my screen for you now if you would like to jump on and present. There we go.
Hi all, can everyone see the slide deck?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'll just introduce myself. My name is Elaine Leong. I'm the Group General Counsel and Group Company Secretary at the Benevolent Society. I also lead, I have the privilege of leading the human rights and modern slavery agenda across the organisation. And I too would like to acknowledge the land that we're all on. I'm on Gadigal land and I extend my that acknowledgement and pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that acknowledgement to all the locations where I'm dialing in from today. I'm here really to talk to you about our organisational approach to tackling modern slavery and in particular what we mean when we say we adopt a human rights approach to modern slavery. It's a phrase I've seen quite a lot and I thought it would be interesting to kind of share with you, like in the context of our organisation, what it means when we say we adopt a human rights approach. Today, my purpose is to give you some really pragmatic examples that I hope that goes away and inspires you in terms of what you might be doing. And later when we do the chat, I'm keen to actually learn from you as well as to what you're doing. What I wanted to say on the outset is that when we first considered the new modern slavery legislation, the organisation, we really asked ourselves, did we want to consider this from a compliance and risk perspective, or do we see this as an opportunity? And for an organisation like the Benevolent Society, it seemed very appropriate that we take that latter option and that we see it as an opportunity. And when I'm referring to opportunity, I'm talking about being curious about what modern slavery is and what an organisation like the Benevolent Society can do to advance this really important global but also local issue. Our organisation has said from the outset, we're not here to kind of set out the most polished modern slavery statement. We don't profess to achieve the most in tackling modern slavery. What's really important for us as an organisation is that we recognise it's a continuous learning journey, and we want the whole organisation to come along this journey. So we don't want this modern slavery agenda to only exist in legal or to only exist in procurement or rolled up into a standalone board report. We want all our staff and indeed the Benevolent Society community to come along. So right from the start, our kind of what I would call our big, hairy, audacious goal has been that if anyone approaches any one of our staff, volunteers, community partners, suppliers, that if they were to ask us about, you know, modern slavery, our people would be able to confidently answer, yep, that's a really important issue to the Benevolent Society. I know my role in this important issue, and if you're interested, you can find out more by going to the Benevolent Society website. So that's been our goal, and that continues to be the goal that we work towards today. What I might do is, because I think I'm having some connectivity issue, I'm actually going to turn my camera off, but I'll leave my presentation slide deck so you can follow as well. So just a little bit about the Benevolent Society, because I'm not sure how many people have heard of us, but we're an Australian charity. We were established in 1813. We have a very old history, obviously. Some of us will know us as advocating for prohibition of child labour in New South Wales, and we're known to have introduced the old age pension. Some of you might know us as having run the Women's Hospital, the first women's hospital of its kind in Australia. Today we run services for children, young people, families, older people and people with disability. We don't specifically run services for victim survivors of modern slavery, but of course, because of the work that we do, they come within our service reach. So we sometimes might come across a victim survivor in like our child protection programs, for example. We also run two advocacy initiatives. Every Child is a national advocacy movement that aims to elevate the conversation about the wellbeing of children and young people. And the other one is Every Age, which tackles ageism against older Australians. So as you can see, the core work of the Benevolent Society naturally lends itself for us to adopt a human rights approach. And the work we do every day at the Benevolent Society, it's founded on rights. But like many other service providers, we don't explicitly turn our mind to human rights. A lot of service providers will refer to their work as helping people, not so much as explicitly upholding rights. But we are seeing there's a shift in this language, particularly in view of the series of recommendations coming out from recent Royal Commissions that have a recommendation focused on human rights. So for the last few years now, we've been leading a program of work that aims to make human rights more explicit in our organisation and to strengthen our rights-based approach. Our key message has been to remind people that they're actually doing this work every day. It's not something new to them. It's just a different framing of the work that they do. So every day our people are protecting and upholding human rights without probably even naming it. And that's something we continually to remind them. Right from national office, not just like our frontline practitioners. So right from national office to our service delivery. The other thing I'll say is that the Benevolent Society, our services and our work is delivered solely in Australia. And our supply chain is also predominantly in Australia. So it would have been an easy assumption for an organisation like us to consider that our starting point in the context of modern slavery is low risk. But we didn't make that assumption. Rather than making that assumption, our question was,
Elaine, your mic.
Sorry, I think I got muted by accident. Can everyone hear? Yeah. So I was just saying that rather than making the assumption that modern slavery is low risk for an organisation that's based in Australia, only delivering services to Australians and has a supply chain that's predominantly Australian, the question we asked was, how is it relevant? So how is modern slavery relevant to us? And what can we do in terms of, you know, having an impact or some change to this agenda? And that's kind of what led us to adopting a human rights lens on modern slavery. I think there's just a bit of echo, so.
If everyone that's not a speaker could please mute themselves, that'd be greatly appreciated.
Elaine, you're still muted, just so you know.
Okay. So I thought I would also just quickly share with you what we mean when we say we're adopting a human rights approach to our work and making human rights explicit. So you'll see I've taken this page out of our strategic plan, and we talk about building human rights in our culture, which I've kind of circled there for you to see. So we want to place human rights at the centre of what we do and front of mind for our people. And our focus is fostering human rights in our culture and not just considering human rights as a tick box or distinct from what we do. So in the context of tackling modern slavery specifically, it means we're talking about taking a broader approach and considering the full spectrum of the Benevolent Society's human rights and impacts on our activities and business relationships, because we know that modern slavery is a serious violation of individual dignity and human rights, and that we're dealing with when we're dealing with modern slavery, we're dealing with a range of rights that have or been violated in the most severe way. And this is how we're building a culture of understanding and awareness of modern slavery across the Benevolent Society. That's what we mean when we talk about a human rights approach. So if we were to drill down what a human rights culture looks like, I won't have time today to talk through these common traits, but we've adopted these principles as our way of breaking down a human rights culture. So this is what was called the panel approach, which is originated, I understand, from Scotland for healthcare settings, and then it was adapted for a broader national dementia strategy, and then approaches to historical abuse, and then more generally to providers of human services. Here in Australia, the Australian Human Rights Commission has been advocating this approach to businesses. And what we've done is we've kind of adapted the panel approach to add an S to talk about safeguarding human rights explicitly. So again, I won't be able to go through these common traits with you, but basically what we're doing is we're working really hard to deeply embed these common traits in our organisational thinking, decision making and action right across our governance, service delivery, relationships and environment. The next few slide decks, I won't go through in detail, but I thought what I would do is I would put the information in the slide deck. So for those who are interested, who can look at it later. But this one is really just sharing with you the KPIs that we've set are in the broad areas of governance, supply chain, internal capability, service delivery and sector collaboration. And what I'm really trying to demonstrate here is that, and I've just shared with you a few key highlights in those areas, is that it really is a journey for us. We haven't embarked on this journey expecting to change things overnight. But probably the one thing I did just want to point out is we didn't go to rush to launch a human rights and modern slavery policy. We did quite a bit of work leading up to it to ensure that it doesn't just exist in a policy, a portfolio or a department, that the work was done to lay the foundations for it to be across the whole organisation before we actually went to launch a policy, because our concern was launching a policy on its own will start framing it in a way where it only exists in that framework, in that portfolio. So that's just something I wanted to point out. The next two slides really is just, this slide is something that our wonderful paralegal Freya puts together. Accountability is a key aspect to our governing framework for human rights and modern slavery, and it's something we want to share with the organisation. So often we, not just in the modern slavery statement, but often throughout the year, we'll share with the organisation how we're going in terms of the things that we set out. And this is an example of an infographic that we might share with the organisation. The other thing we share is lessons learned, but I'm going to share that with you a little bit later in this presentation. The other thing that's worth just very quickly pointing out is kind of safeguarding the stakeholder voice is so important in this journey of human rights and modern slavery, and making sure you map out kind of your stakeholder engagement, the voice for stakeholders there, your grievance mechanisms is a really important point in the context of modern slavery, but also if you're dealing with the wider UN guiding principles on business and human rights. This next slide, I'm just conscious of time. I wanted to share with you that the other focus we've been working on over the last 18 months is life cycle mapping. So we've been undertaking life cycle mapping in the consideration of our directors, employees, volunteers, community partners, suppliers, and I'm just sharing with you now a very high level life cycle mapping of our employee journey. Because I think there's been a lot of focus on supply chain, and that's why I made a conscious decision not to focus on supply chain in this presentation, but to talk about like the culture and how to embed this in our culture. So what you see here is basically all the critical touch points in the employee life cycle on when they might engage with modern slavery, irrespective of the role that they have at the Benevolent Society. So we'll have reference to our culture, our human rights culture in, job ads at the recruitment stage. Onboarding, there is reference to human rights and modern slavery. New employee joining the Benevolent Society, within the first month, they have to join a human rights clinic where we do a bit of a deep dive with them on human rights and modern slavery. And in particular, we will take them through some case studies where we'll kind of outline indicators to them and how they might come across some of these important issues. We also, for our executives and senior leaders, they undertake a human rights decision-making clinic, which is where they kind of learn about the how to make decisions that are compatible with human rights. And some of you may be familiar with that framework, but that's a big part of our human rights framework at the moment. We also have a library of resources, and we have a workplace discussion forum where employees can discuss like issues arising that they might see, in the media or otherwise. Throughout the year, we're going to launch an internal campaign this year, but throughout the year, we didn't want to just launch one campaign in the year and then go silent. So we have a calendar of significant days where it's a reminder to people about these particular issues. And then, of course, like many organisations who have joined today, we have a Human Rights and Modern Slavery Committee, which is championed by representatives across the organisation, and they will do portfolio updates throughout the year. So that's a very quick overview of our employee life cycle and how we try to make sure there are various touch points for those issues along the way for an employee. I also just wanted to quickly share with you, in terms of our library of resources, it's quite a library at the moment, but the ones that are worth pointing out is we've got a series on human rights, which goes through like how is the right relevant to our workers, and what's the connection to modern slavery. So that's something that we've been building over the last 18 months, and we'll probably complete it this reporting period. We have a modern slavery easy read guide, which is really important to our frontline practitioners and our clients as well. So that's probably one of our most popular guides that we have. We have a human rights assessment tool, which is a little bit probably technical, so I won't go through that today. But the other thing that I thought was worth pointing out is that we developed a modern slavery team activity toolkit, which is really popular amongst our teams, which is a toolkit of various activities where small teams can talk about how the work that they do impacts or is relevant to the issue of modern slavery. Now, there's a great saying that goes something like, if you go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think it really demonstrates the impact of collaborations. And certainly at the Benevolent Society, we couldn't achieve impact without collaborations. And in the context of modern slavery, I thought I would just share, I think the last time I was here in this forum, I was part of the audience and I shared our Modern Slavery Community Partner Toolkit, which is a toolkit we've developed for those community partners that actually are very small. They don't reach the threshold for reporting, but because of government grants or philanthropic funding, they might be required to consider this area, or indeed because they think it's the right thing to do, but they don't know where to start. So we've developed that community partner toolkit for the smaller sized organisations. We also chair and facilitate a Modern Slavery Charities and Not-for-Profit Forum, which is a forum for like shared learning and advocacy in our sector. We meet quarterly. When we initiated this forum, it was really for charities and not-for-profits, but certainly in the short-term future, we are wanting to look at collaborations with government, private sector. So if you are interested in collaborating with members of this forum, which I can give you details later, please feel free to get in touch. I also thought just very quickly to share with you, if you are thinking of partnering or collaborating with an NGO or charity, the ACNC Charity Register is a really good starting point for due diligence. So the ACNC is the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. They've been around for a number of years. They're our regulator. Their register has recently been enhanced so that it provides details on activities, where a charity operates, financials, board memberships, charity and tax endorsement status. So that's a good starting point if you're kind of looking at whether or not whether you're wanting to partner with a particular charity or just doing general due diligence on a charity. And again, I'll send those details through and they can be sent out. I thought to end this this presentation, I would just share with you some of the lessons learned over the years for us, being that firstly, it's not a linear process. Like our commitment to embracing and embedding human rights means we're constantly evaluating and re-evaluating risk to people, particularly when considering we're dealing with COVID, floods now, bushfires. Increasing organisational capability on human rights decision making also takes time. It can be a very technical process. And then partnerships is key. I think we've spoken about that. I think particularly if you're working in charity and dealing with human services, there are blurred lines when it comes to trying to distinguish between protecting, promoting and respecting human rights. And then probably just circling back to that point on deep listening to victim survivor voice is really necessary and an essential starting point to kind of an authentic journey in this space. I would really encourage people to consider that. I thought I won't talk about this slide too much, except to say that like a lot of organisations, we've started to undertake a big mapping exercise around our sustainable development goals. As part of that exercise, we are identifying our salient human rights issues. Modern slavery we've identified so far is one for us to watch. You know, guided by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. That's something that we're hoping to continue to advance. And again, it kind of brings another sphere of learning for this organisation. For those of you who have joined, I think there are a couple of human service providers here. The other area that I thought would be worth mentioning is we are producing some guides specifically for families and communities in the next 12 months. One would be around the connection between coercive control and modern slavery, so the connection there. And the other one we're looking at is really for parents and carers. If they wanted to start talking to their children about modern slavery, how would you start that conversation? Really, that's what I wanted to cover today. And I think I'm going to hand back to you, Nicholas. Is that right?
Absolutely. Thanks, Elaine, for sharing that with us. Some very good resources there. Well done. I really appreciate that. And we've had a lot of questions that we'll cover off when we come to the Q&A. And I think good time to introduce James, our second speaker today.
Absolutely. I will just share my screen again and we'll jump into James's presentation.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. Thanks, Anna. Wonderful to be with you all today. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation here in the Northern Rivers, which has obviously been an area hit very hard by climate change recently. But I want to acknowledge also what it means to speak to you about this issue, Xinjiang, from this place, the traditional lands of the Bundjalung people. We need to acknowledge not only that the land that I'm speaking you to from was the foundation for the economy here in the Northern Rivers in southeast Queensland, but also that the involuntary labour of First Nations people and indeed of Pacifica people blackbirded from the South Pacific to this region and was a foundation for the economy here. and that was part of a larger set of policies about economic development and assimilation that guided our development of our political economy around here. That's really important to understand when we think about the reasons why we see such severe forced labor and human rights risks in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So let me begin by asking why we should care here in Australia about this problem that I'm going to talk to you today. As I'll describe in a minute, it's a severe human rights risk, and that activates your responsibility to respect human rights as described in the UN Guiding Principles and the relevant OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. But even more fundamentally than that, it's a risk exposure for your business potentially. As Anna's showing here on the slide, Xinjiang is the source of 20% of the world's cotton, 18% of the world's tomatoes, and 45% of an element called polysilicon, which is a fundamental component of solar panels. Anna, there's just a problem apparently with the way the slides are being displayed. So if we could maybe have a look at that as we go along, that would be great.
Can you see
And
that?
if we could go back to that slide, or maybe the third slide, that would be great. The one that says Y at the top.
Can you see
Thank
better
you.
now?
Yes, thank you. I think so. So this is a problem for any business that is importing or exposed to cotton, tomatoes, or indeed solar power. So even companies that are buying solar power as part of an abatement issue. But it's not only those supply chains where Xinjiang is implicated. In fact, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region labor is exported to other parts of China, and therefore there are forced labor risks in numerous supply chains that run through China, including electronics and many others. Now, why has Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which I'll just call Xinjiang from now on, why has that become so central a problem of forced labor? Well, essentially, as part of its governance strategy, the Chinese Communist Party over the last decade has poured resources into the region and turned it into a low-cost business hub. So low-cost land, low-cost electricity. The solar panels that come out of Xinjiang are made with polysilicon, generated with coal-fired electricity, extremely high emission electricity, and low-cost labor. And that's the central problem from a modern slavery perspective. This is a program or a policy called the Surplus Rural Labor Program. It essentially coerces Uyghurs and other minority workers off the land, out of their traditional land lifestyle, into industrialized work. And in doing that, it moves them often either directly into forced labor or through a system of coercive control in internment. The best reports suggest that over 1 million people have been detained in this way. We know now from both first-hand testimony, from documents, from numerous sources, that this is leading to widespread and severe human rights abuses. We're not just talking forced labor, we're talking physical and sexual assault, forced sterilization, forced disappearances, torture, a number of other grave and severe human rights abuses. The program to move some of these people into industrial labor in private employ, subsidized by the state, works not only in Xinjiang, but in factories and work sites throughout China, including in the east. So as I said, supply chains operating out of factories in the east of China may also be exposed to these kinds of risks. Now, traditionally, the way we deal with these kinds of problems in supply chains is through audits, through social audits, human rights due diligence on the ground. But that is essentially impossible in Xinjiang now, and seems to be impossible in relation to this program in other parts of China. When I say impossible, what I mean is that professional companies that have been doing this kind of work in China are now exposed to harassment, abuse, doxing, detention of the individuals conducting the work and their family members, confiscation of assets, raids, seizure of documents, and all of that under color of law as a result of new laws brought in China over the last 18 months. So it's essentially impossible to conduct human rights due diligence in that way, raising some difficult policy questions for us all. I want to emphasize that although the Chinese Communist Party argues that none of these policies violate their obligations, legislatures around the world and recently the ILO Committee of Experts found that in fact it does violate international legal obligations, that there are at least 4 of the 11 ILO indicators of forced labour present, and that according to the UK Parliament, for example, this amounts to genocide, certainly crimes against humanity. So in terms of the human rights risk you might be exposed to, this is the most severe type of risk you could be exposed to. Next slide, please. So what are governments doing about this? Well, over 300 binding measures have been proposed, adopted, or in fact been adopted and then expired to date. We've documented these in a data set at xinjiangsanctions.info. It includes not only the over 300 measures from Western governments, but also the 50 Chinese countermeasures where the Chinese Communist Party sanctioned Western actors. And next week, we'll be releasing both updates to those data sets and a new corporate responses data set that documents the responses of 250 companies to these allegations. Next slide, please. In this slide, you can see just a little bit of information about who's been adopting these measures. So you can see that the majority in force have been adopted in the United States, but there are a wide range of other countries that have already adopted binding measures. This is only binding legal measures, not political statements. Australia has currently adopted none, but as I'll come back to in a moment, there are some important considerations in place in Parliament at the moment that might change that. Next slide, please. What kind of measures are these? Well, they cover everything from asset restrictions, asset freezes, through to business guidance, through to import and export bans. Next slide, please. I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to highlight some of the most important measures that are in the mix these days. A couple from the United States to begin with. First, there is in place in the United States a provision under the Tariff Act that allows the government to exclude goods that it believes were made in whole or in part with forced labour. And it has measures in place specifically to exclude cotton, tomatoes, and selected solar products. Last year, 912 such shipments were excluded, and that was covered goods worth several $billions. The value of the goods seized is going up dramatically. Congress has given more money to the part of customs that deals with this, and this is now having a demonstration effect overseas. Not only that, late last year, the Congress adopted a new law that from June of this year will exclude any good that is made with forced labour by Uyghur forced labour in China. So that covers all of the things I was talking about, cotton, tomatoes, solar panels, and is expected to have a really dramatic effect. It puts the onus on the importer to demonstrate that its goods were not made with forced labour. And of course, that's going to have important implications, not only for retailers, but also potentially for investors and even, frankly, for banks who may be banking businesses that are exposed to that kind of risk. The EU is now considering something similar, not a customs ban, but a product withdrawal instrument. So any good that is on the single market in the EU found to be made in whole or in part with forced labour will be forced to be taken off the market. And it recently published new human rights due diligence proposals in the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Initiative, which is now before the EU Parliament. So that will, if it passes, and it's expected to pass later this year, require corporations operating in the EU to conduct detailed mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence and attach civil liability if they fail to do that. How about here in Australia? Well, the key thing to know about here is that our Parliament in Canberra is considering a forced labour ban for goods made anywhere in the world, except Australia, I should note, with forced labour. And it's unlikely that's going to pass before the election, almost certain, I would say, but it is very likely that it will be picked up whichever party is in power after the election, and that debate will be taken forward. So it's quite likely, you see the direction of travel here, is that companies in Australia are going to be operating in environment, both in Australia and in some of our key markets abroad, where these kinds of issues are moving from the voluntary disclosure much more to the mandatory due diligence context. But in a context, as I said, where doing due diligence on the ground is essentially impossible, which means we have to start thinking about moving supply from Xinjiang, from parts of China where they're using the surplus rural labor program to other sources of supply. So in some forthcoming work we're about to publish, if we could go to the next slide, we think about what are the impacts of these sanctions today. Now, the key thing to understand here is they differ by sector. Xinjiang's role in different sectors is quite different. It's the source of 45% of polysilicon, but only 18% of tomatoes. And tomatoes are pretty substitutable. Tomatoes grown in Australia are fairly substitutable on quality for tomatoes grown in Xinjiang. So it's much more a competition on price. Now, generally across different markets, what we see is three different types of things happening. And the literature calls this trade reallocation, when exporters decide they can't reach a certain market because of an import ban, so they have to reallocate to another market. Secondly, trade diversion. So they still go to the same market, but they go through an intermediary country. And third, product transformation. They have to change the product so it's not made with forced labor in the first place. And that's obviously ultimately what these policies are designed to achieve, product transformation. So how is that going? Well, in the research we're about to publish, we find that in the tomato sector, what we're mainly seeing is trade diversion. So goods from Xinjiang are still reaching European Western shelves, but they're going through other markets and they're essentially mixed with water, repackaged as goods made in Italy is a key intermediary market, or indeed Russia was a key intermediary market, but that's obviously likely to change now. Next slide, please. Cotton. What about cotton? In that case, what we see is both trade diversion through intermediary countries like Bangladesh and reallocation. So goods from Xinjiang aren't going anymore to Western markets in some cases. They're being absorbed in particular by the Chinese markets. But some purchasers see the product that comes from northern Xinjiang in particular, which is long staple cotton, as non-substitutable. So they can't find alternative sources of supply. And they're really grappling with these difficult questions of how they deal, in this case, with this severe human rights risk. The extra challenge we have in the garment and retail apparel sector is that if you are selling not only in Western Europe or Australia, but also in China, so if you're a big retailer like Nike or H&M or someone like that, you are facing potentially a major backlash in China from consumers and from the government for acknowledging that there are forced labor concerns in Xinjiang. So as a result, we're beginning to see a very difficult choice for some of these global retailers about how they deal with a Chinese government pushing them to deny forced labor concerns in Xinjiang, and Western markets, not only governments, but markets, investors that are insisting that they grapple with this problem. And we haven't solved for that yet, but the key solution is probably around developing new sources of supply. And that brings us to solar sector. Now, I think this is, next slide, please. This is a major sleeper issue for Australia. Over 80% of our solar panels come from China, and it's not easy to turn on alternative supply because of the sunk costs in solar panel manufacturing, and in particular polysilicon, which is the key element of the solar panels that comes from Xinjiang. So what we see, though, is that the manufacturers in the middle of this supply chain are now beginning to develop a bifurcated supply chain. They have clean plants in places like Vietnam that don't use Chinese polysilicon, that don't use forced labor, that produce clean solar panels that they're going to be exporting to the West. But those same manufacturers have dirty plants using forced labor, using Xinjiang polysilicon to produce solar panels for consumption in markets that aren't imposing this requirement, particularly in China. This is a recipe, as you can see, for increased costs, for reduced, for slower uptake of solar, for reduced innovation, and for geopolitics, frankly. So we need to be thinking about ways that we can manage these kinds of issues along the solar supply chain, solar value chain. And as a result, the financial sector, investors, which are obviously exposed to solar in a big way, are becoming increasingly involved. And we may see, as our research that we'll publish in a couple of weeks discusses in more detail, we may see a move towards a multi-stakeholder approach. But as I said, the way that you build solar panels is it requires big capital expenditure, long lead times in capacity. This is an industrial policy question. And so it necessarily is going to require the involvement of government, and in fact, governments plural, given the transnational nature of this value chain. So this isn't something that business can solve on its own, but that's not to say there isn't a role for business, and that in fact, business can sit on its hands and wait. Not to address this problem now would frankly be not just a question of modern slavery risk, but a strategic risk for organisations that have exposure to this. Under the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, directors have to sign off on statements, Modern Slavery Act statements. So if you're not addressing these risks and you're exposed to them and your directors are signing off on that, that raises some pretty interesting legal questions, which I know civil society actors are now beginning to think about in terms of potential liability exposure for failing to disclose what are potentially material risks, given the questions around market access and impact on share price, for example. Next slide. In a couple of weeks, we'll be releasing a new report which looks in depth at these questions around the solar industry and offers a new approach to estimating forced labour risk in the solar energy production risk of different countries. And on this slide, I'm giving you the first sneak peek at the results, some of the key results in this report, which estimate the forced labour risk present in the solar energy production on-grid photovoltaic for the top 30 solar producing countries in the world. On the left, you have forced labour risk per kilowatt hour, and on the right, you have forced labour risk per US dollar of levelized cost of electricity. Happy to share more about that in Q&A or later on. Next slide. The last point I want to make is about the key issues that remain unresolved. We're operating now in this environment of these proliferating sanctions, but are they having the intended impact? Will they actually change forced labour risks on the ground? The challenge with solar is that if we end up with a bifurcated supply chain, yes, buyers may be insulated from modern slavery risk because they're no longer buying solar panels made with forced labour. But if those solar panels are still being made with forced labour and just sold to someone else, then we have to ask, are we actually reducing modern slavery risk? And if not, what kind of policies and practices do we need in place to really reduce risk to people, which is the key objective here and key objective required under the UN Guiding Principles. The second key question that's still not resolved, I'd have to say, is what really is feasible and expected? We're encouraging businesses in all other human rights risk areas to rely on due diligence. But in this uniquely severe human rights risk area around Xinjiang, doing due diligence on the ground isn't just impossible, it's actually dangerous to people. So what are the alternatives and what is expected? So there are now leaders in industry developing sets of principles and expectations about disengagement from Xinjiang. Over what time period should businesses withdraw from what kinds of supplier relationships, and how can they make themselves accountable for that kind of process of phased disengagement? The answer probably needs to be different according to different industries, because you have different approaches to substitutability, different CapEx expenditure to develop new capacity, different role for government, depending on, for example, whether this is a strategic issue like solar is. Also, a key role is emerging for finance, for investors in particular. This is a key issue for ESG risk assessment, and we're also beginning to see the insurance industry wake up to the risk this is posing for them. In the US, we see some movement for sanctions to move into capital markets. What I mean by that is some restrictions placed on investors investing in the specific firms that are connected to these modern slavery risks. If we see that happen at scale, that will accelerate the need for the financial sector to get involved. But fundamentally, there's also a role for government here. So what we need is, back to a point that Elaine highlighted, key role for collaboration and partnerships, not only between business and civil society, but in this case, also with government involved. So I thank you all for your time and attention. I look forward to the Q&A. And if you'd like to know more about all of this work and receive the reports that are coming down the pipe, please go to xinjiangsanctions.info. There's a very easy sign-up form there, and we look forward to engaging with you all in the future. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. The questions have been coming in thick and fast. I'm really looking forward to that Q&A section, but that's at the end. So we've got Todd Kleindienst from ABF next. If Janke, Anna, if you just want to introduce Todd, please.
Of course, Todd, if you would like to share your screen when you're ready. Todd, as I mentioned earlier, is the Director of Business and Government Engagement and is a part of the Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking branch at the ABF. Thanks, Todd.
Excellent. Excellent. Can people hear me?
Yeah.
That's a good start. And can you see my screen? Am I sharing that screen yet?
I can see it, yes.
Excellent. Okay, all right. So we've got the screen up. You can hear me. Thank you very much, everybody. It's good to be here again. I was at the last one, so I really enjoy these sessions, and it's great to see another great turnout. What I'll do is I'd like to give an acknowledgement of country in the Ngunnawal language, as what we often do here in the ACT. Before I get started, Daura Nuna, Daura Ngunnawal, Yangu Nala Manyan, Duni Manyan. Ngunnawalwari, Daudawari, Dindi Wangara, Lejinyin. This is Ngunnawal country. Today we meet on Ngunnawal country. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the elders. Okay. Just again, a little bit of an introduction. It was said earlier that I am the Director of the Business and Government Engagement Unit, but I'm also part of the Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking branch. And primarily that branch within the Australian Border Force sort of got just three key areas. You can see the context of what the ABF branch that I'm in is doing. We have an international capacity building component, which does work throughout our region to develop capacity to deal with modern slavery, human trafficking. We have another element of our branch which coordinates and drafts the National Action Plan on dealing with modern slavery and human trafficking. So runs intergovernmental committees and networks to draft that national strategy with the AFP, Fair Work Australia, Attorney General, lots of other government bodies. Then you have my branch, my team within that branch, and you have the Government Engagement Unit, which is responsible for the complying with the Modern Slavery Act for the Commonwealth, doing a Commonwealth statement. So yeah, we also have to do a statement. So which is great for us to see what's involved, and keeps us honest by having to publish on the register our own statement. Then I have a business engagement team, which they're the ones who sort of deal with what we're dealing with here today, primarily, where they maintain the online register, that public register, receive and assess all of those statements, load them up on the register, and provide the help desk and provide guides, material, etc., all of that, and do sessions like these, smaller sessions like these around the country. And also have a small part of my team which will be responsible for helping run the Modern Slavery Act review this year. So we're all pretty busy. It's going to be a pretty busy year. So that's what my team is and where it fits in the big scheme of things. So I'll just give an update on just some, sort of where we're at and some of the things, trends we're seeing and where we're going. I guess as most people are aware, we have our online register for modern slavery statements. You can see it there. It's publicly available. I think it was the first of its kind in the world, even though we didn't have the first Modern Slavery Act. This was the first of its kind. And you can see there now the type of input we're getting into that modern slavery register, where under the Act, Australian entities or entities doing business in Australia with a revenue greater than $100 million, must submit a modern slavery statement. But you can do them voluntary there as well, as you can see. But you can see there where we're at already in terms of we've had over 8,000 entities now covered by statements on the register. There's 2 Commonwealth statements in there. We're busily preparing our third one now, and over 4,000 statements. They're lodged, just under 500 voluntary, and from 42 countries. And a key one there for us is that searches number there, over 730,000 searches, because that's what the Modern Slavery Act's intent was initially. It's a transparency framework to fit in with a number of other strategies. So with the aim being where people have their statements published on this web for everyone to see, and then they can go under, I guess it's using, reputational risk as one of the key drivers there was the philosophy behind the Modern Slavery Act, and particularly with this, the register is the way it is. So it's great to see there the number of searches and also the number of statements. But it's certainly, I think some of the initial estimates were, in early days when they were just thinking about the Act, they thought there might be 3,000 entities or so that might need to lodge statements on this, but you can see there it's now over 8,000. Yeah, so what are some of the reporting trends we've seen? This has been fairly consistent in terms of, some of the, I've got there, what are some of the poor areas, or what are people doing well? And we're into our what is now called our second reporting period. The first reporting period just finished 30th of June last year, due to a number of factors. There was a COVID extension. There was, when they first kicked off, there was a number of different reporting timelines people can do. That'll be the international one, the calendar year, or the Australian financial year. But officially the first reporting period ended at June last year. But these trends that I'm reporting on here a lot of them were primarily for that first reporting period. But we're still seeing some of these in the second reporting period, although we have seen some improvements, which I'll address a little later. But what are some of the good things we see that we see when our assessors are looking at the statements that come in? It is those ones that just clearly address those mandatory criteria for content, and often the good ones are those that really spell out, fairly basically, either in a table or in a format, what are each of the criteria, and what are we doing under each one, is often a marker of those better statements. Other good things we're seeing is the ones that, I guess this comes under mandatory criteria 7, about other information, how they address the COVID-19 impacts, because COVID-19, as a lot of research has shown, does impact modern slavery and human trafficking, in a negative way. So the good statements have actions and what they're doing to address those in them. Other good things we see are those that have the case studies and practical examples. So they're really getting, highlighting in a bit more detail how they do things, and what they're doing to mitigate risk and remediate. So, so there is some really good statements in there that highlight that. And the other one's too about setting out their plan for future action, how they're going to do that continuous improvement. So there's some of the good things that we're seeing. Some of the not so good things we're seeing. We're still seeing where people or entities aren't indicating the principal governing body for approval or the signature by a responsible member, and we can't publish those statements because they haven't really officially been approved, so they always get bounced straight back and then need to come back correctly signed. But we're still seeing that coming through. A lot of the big ones where people are falling down on the mandatory criteria is not describing consultation, and the key one there is it's not just normal consultations. It's actually, or might have some great consultation mechanisms in their organisation. It's a consultation that was conducted, the Act outlines, in developing that modern slavery statement. So what was the consultation that occurred in developing that? So a lot of entities fall over on that. Another one is that focusing on risk in the supply chains to the exclusion of risks in the onshore operations, or within their operations. So it's not just about supply chains, the Modern Slavery Act as well. It is about operations, so that needs to be covered as well. And the last one there is not defining how the entity assesses the effectiveness of actions taken to combat modern slavery. Again, the Act doesn't require people to say we are effective. It's describing how they're assessing that effectiveness and what are they doing about it. So they're the key reporting trends of what we're seeing that's good, what we're seeing that's consistently, or more often than not, when you have a statement that's not compliant, what the issues are. So for future reporting, we really want to see those areas of improvement that I've just described there being addressed and worked on to continue the trend of improved compliance. Another one too is that increasing sophistication of responses. Remember a lot of the analysis has been done recently has been on entities' first Commonwealth statements. So remember, 4 or 5 years ago, there was no statements. Now we've got over 4,000, which is good. But now we need to see, obviously, an increase in sophistication of responses. And that goes for the Commonwealth as well. You'll see our second statement is a little bit more sophisticated than our first statement, and we need to keep that progress going now for ourselves as we go through the different tiers and understand our supply chain tiers better, than to increase the sophistication of our response. So we'd like to see that. And the other one there is that increasing collaboration. And I think it was just touched a bit on in some of the previous presentations too. Collaboration in this space is key, whether it be within the organisation. People shouldn't be creating these statements in isolation, but other external collaboration activities as well is important. We need to see more of, and that's events such as this, or I think it's been talked about earlier, that these sorts of problems don't get solved by government working their own, or business, or civil society. It's all three working together. And then we can see, even now globally, it's when those three work together, you can start to have an effect, that joint effect, when you have government, business, and civil society working together. So collaboration is key. We need more of it, and we're keen for it. A bit on the compliance with the Act. So we are seeing an improvement of compliance from the first reporting period through that second reporting period, which we're in now, which will end in June 30 this year. And we hope to see this trend continue as understanding and awareness continues to increase. What do I mean by, what are some of the I guess underlying statistics that make me say that compliance has been improving? Well, in that first reporting period I was talked about, that ended on 30 June 2021, roughly from statements of compliant to non-compliant, from how we assess them, and we're assessing against the mandatory criteria as per the Act, we had a figure of roughly 40% non-compliant, 60%. That was a rough figure for the end of the first reporting period. But now, just for example, just in 2022, where we've already had over 1,000 statements come in, because there was a late surge at the end of December as one of the reporting periods came to its close. That's why I had the team very busy the first 3 weeks of January. We just were assessing those 900 statements and got all those done and now all published. So that was sort of the focus of my business engagement team, with assistance very early in the year. So, but now, as we speak today, there's over 1,000 statements have been assessed, and for us, the compliance rate we're seeing at the moment is about 80% to 80% compliant, 20% non-compliant, roughly, for the current figures. Another example is when I talked about that entities not getting the correct sign-off, whether it be approval or from the correct governance body. In the first reporting period I talked about, ending June last year, was about 27% of statements coming in had a problem with that. And again, that 1,000 statements that I'm talking about that we've looked at coming in this year, the 1,000 we've seen already is at 14%. So there is some improvement there, just in the bulk numbers. In relation to compliance with the Act, the ABF wrote, there was a lot of obviously non-compliance in that first reporting period. We actually wrote to all entities who we considered not to have addressed all the mandatory reporting criteria for their first modern slavery statement. So we spent a bit of time doing that, reaching out to entities with that. And we're currently completing a more detailed analysis of entities who failed to submit a statement for the first reporting period. So we're using a lot of tax data that didn't come until the end of last year. The first reporting period finished June last year. Got some tax data late last year. Now we're in the final stages of analysing that information and start to look for the entities that should have reported that didn't. Also, in relation to the compliance with the Act, we do things. Other things we try to assist businesses in complying with the Act. We've developed a range of guidance materials to help reduce the frequency of errors. We've got about 13, I think, guidance products on our online register, and we'll try aim to develop those further this year. We have a number of resources on there, and the team, since it started, has provided over 2,400 responses to entities through our online help desk. So I'll show the details of that help desk at the end. We still have that help desk running, and we've conducted 130 face-to-face and virtual awareness raising workshops and presentations as well as part of our trying to assist people in complying with the Act. Okay, another key one for us is the engagement with academia and civil society. I was talking earlier about that collaboration. We're committed to providing that greater transparency to the public by publishing all modern slavery statements that have met the appropriate approval requirements. So so you can see there, that's why even statements that aren't compliant with the Act get published, because we're promoting that transparency, and for research and everyone to see the effort that others are putting into treating this risk. So and I think there's a disclaimer in there which sort of indicates that not all statements on that register have been assessed as compliant. They have the key thing is they've met that approval and signature requirement. But we welcome the continued academic and civil society analysis and independent reports of modern slavery statements that are being published on our register, and any subsequent public discussion. And there's been some recent ones, and then there's been media discussion as well, which we welcome, because that's what, again, the overall intent of that Act initially was that it's a transparency model, and we want lots of smart people getting together and analysing what's out there. And I've just highlighted there some of the 4 recent reports that quite a few of them did involve media discussion. The ACSI 200 report, which was done by Pillar 2 for ACSI, the Monash University report that came out, I think it was December late last year. Another one with the Paper Promises report, again, just coming out recently by the the Human Rights Law Centre, with a number of editors. I don't know, University of New South Wales and a few others under it, but we certainly we read all these reports with interest, and we actually meet up with these teams when we can. So my teams have already met up with the Monash University team. We've already had some briefings by the Human Rights Law Centre team, and we're actually going to do more of that and follow that up. And there's another one there too. You can see there by Walk Free and Wiki Rates, their most recent report, Beyond Compliance in the Garment Sector, assessing UK and Australian Modern Slavery Act statements in the garment industry. And I've certainly had a meeting with them to talk about their report as well. So we encourage those sorts of reports being published, analysing what's there on the register. And to assist with that, we work with a number of recently did some work with researchers to implement a number of new features, the online register, to assist research, and that's ongoing. At the moment, we're doing some technical fixes to the register in the process of that, and so we certainly reached out to a number of these key research and civil society to say, what would help research better, and then we'll try and do as much as that we can now, but then obviously note to improve it where we can in the future. All right, just a couple of other things about what the team does, which is relevant for implementing the Modern Slavery Act. We do then, the Act says we have to publish an annual report on the implementation of the Act. The most recent one was published after our last meeting on the 25th of November, and these are all available on our website. And yeah, this report details the government's work to raise awareness of the Act, how we support good practice, and the work we do to strengthen the government's response to modern slavery risks in its own supply chains and operations. But the 2021 annual report will be published this year, and that's when we aim to provide a bigger document, providing more detailed analysis of compliance with the Act over that first reporting period that I was talking about. So we're doing that at the moment. That report will come out later this year. Just touch again quickly too, talk about the Commonwealth statements that we have to produce as well. So the second one too, Commonwealth Modern Slavery Statement, was released after the last one of these sessions. It's now available on the Modern Slavery Register, like everybody else's. And we adopted a risk-based approach in that as well for us. The Commonwealth is a huge procurer. It's the largest procurer of goods and services in the Australian market, about $70 billion a year through 80,000 contracts is our leverage. So and that Commonwealth statement has to cover 98 non-corporate Commonwealth entities. So you can see there it is a fairly big undertaking, and the Commonwealth is starting out as well, like other business have been over the last couple of years, to get their statements in order. So the key areas that we've been focusing on in our second Commonwealth statement was, investments, textile procurement, construction, cleaning and security services, and ICT hardware procurement were identified early as a lot of our the high risk areas for us. And for our third Commonwealth statement that we're producing, we've really moved now from that discovery phase into our implementation phase of our own statement. So we're very busy now, again, working with our 98 non-corporate Commonwealth entities, trying to get a better understanding of our lower tier, all of the lower tiers within our supply chains. And we do work with civil society and other groups to help us do that as well. So there is collaboration with us in trying to do that. And so we're sort of at that, I feel like, that implementation phase of the Commonwealth Statement. So the third Commonwealth Statement, we're getting more detail now and getting direct inputs and more detailed inputs from those lower levels within the Commonwealth. The training and procurement's going through, and elements dealing with modern slavery and human trafficking going into our tender clauses through our procurement officers, and then we're going to start obviously pushing it now into contract management. So that's our sort of our own journey with doing statements. Just a bit on the Modern Slavery Act review that I talked about earlier. We have to commence a legislative review of the Modern Slavery Act in 2022. According to the Act, after 3 years, it does need to be reviewed, and then we've got 12 months to review it and get that report into Parliament about the recommendations. And so that'll be tabled in Parliament, pretty much 12 months after it kicks off. And then the viewer will look at the first 3 years of the Act's operation and consider compliance with legislation and measures that could be done to improve the Act. So it is a big year. It's been in place. You can see what the original intent of the Act was, and you can see from a lot of those reports that have already come in and analysing the Act, which are great. You can see the types of issues that people are already raising and talking about. So it's going to be a great opportunity this year for those who want to influence or influence the future of the Act in ways that'll make it more effective. Well, that window will be opening this year. But the exact timing process will be announced by the government in due course. So there's a lot of planning's gone into it now. We're just just waiting for the government now to announce that final date where it kicks off. But it will be a collaborative and open consultation process. There will be a lot of consultation happening around the place with with inputs from all sectors of society. We'll obviously put out consultation paper. Have those meetings, etc., consultative meetings to really try and improve this Act. And that was really it from me. As I mentioned earlier, we do have a help desk there at that slavery consultations email address there. That is the team's help desk. We do have that guidance for reporting entities there on our register, and there's a link for the register, but it's just Google online modern slave register. There it is. And that's really it for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Todd. Great. And just to share some compliments that have been coming through whilst you've been speaking, it's great to see how open the ABF is to show everything, warts and all. So that's really good. A couple of questions I'll just fire at you, and I'm trying to sort of consolidate them. What are the consequences for non-compliance? And how detailed is the feedback to entities where they might not be non-compliant? Those are a few questions rolled into one. I don't know if you can address those one at a time. That'd be brilliant.
Yeah, well, I guess the first initially the policy was implemented. So the first phase of the Act was to really work with business, I guess, in a consultative manner to help them lodge statements and do the right thing. So that's really been the focus in the first phase. And the Act in relation to compliance, it doesn't have a great deal of, if you like, power. It's not. Remember, they're trying to use reputation. It's a transparency Act, not one where you go with people with a big stick yet. So the Act really in compliance, if entities aren't compliant, the ultimate, I guess, power of the minister is naming and shaming. But as I said, the emphasis being that first phase is to work with entities. And when we have gone out to entities, there's a lot of entities. Our team just goes out to entities with a brief comment of what criteria they've not met, and then where they can get help to them improve in that, where they can get help to improve. So again, said there's obviously a lot of entities there that at first contact has been just highlighting you're not meeting these criteria, and then we point them in the right direction of where you can improve those. That's, hopefully I've answered that one.
Thanks, Todd. Maybe a question for James. Sort of the ultimate sort of resolution is to just find a new supplier. What impact can that have on the victims that are literally the victim of the issue that we're trying to sort of avoid and mitigate. How can we help that situation that we don't make it even worse for them?
So this is a great question on two levels. First of all, it's a tough question to answer, but secondly, it's great that people are asking this question, because it shows that what is sinking in is that the orientation of the obligations under both the Modern Slavery Act and more broadly the international standard with which that is aligned, the UN Guiding Principles, is that you shouldn't cut and run, that you should seek to engage with suppliers that have forced labour issues in their production processes and remediate those problems over time. It's a relationship question. But there are cases where, when you go through all of that process, you've done your due diligence, you've built leverage, you've used that leverage, you still end up at the bottom of the decision tree at this horrible box where it has no effect. And in very, very rare, severe cases, we may get straight to that box because there are obstacles to doing effective remediation on the ground. In fact, doing remediation on the ground may make the risks to people worse. And Xinjiang, according to the top human rights organizations and the top business and human rights organizations in the world, seems, alas, to be one of those cases where effective engagement on the ground is just not possible, in part because this is state-backed forced labour. This is a bit different from the forced labour that arises because of the choices of individual businesses, which is the case in most of the supply chains you're dealing with. Here, we've got a very powerful government that has adopted a policy that subsidizes for businesses the use of forced labour, and that criminalizes the ability of manufacturers in China to even answer straightforwardly or truthfully or reliably your due diligence questions. So that brings us to this problem. How does us disengaging have a positive impact for people on the ground? The answer is, it doesn't solve the problem for them, but it doesn't make the problem worse. This is about essentially a do no harm situation. But it goes back to this point that in rare cases like this, there's a need for collective effort by multiple business entities, by investors, and by government to think through what the solution is for those people who remain in that difficult situation. Now, one argument is that when that demand for their services dries up, when the demand for particular goods dries up, they'll be moved into other industries, and maybe they'll be moved out of forced labour. Frankly, it's too early to tell whether that logic is going to play out, but that appears to be the situation we're in. So normally the answer would be absolutely stay, engage, solve the problem. But this is one of those rare cases where, in fact, we have to be thinking about phased disengagement and sourcing alternative supply. Over.
Thanks, Jim. Todd, I might just give you sort of a few seconds to answer that too. What's the ABF's take on that?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, there's I guess government legislation before the before the Parliament at the moment, and I guess it's just I mean, it's not my job to comment on the policy and where it go. I'll implement whatever policy I get given. That's what I do. So I can't really comment on the policy or where things should go, other than say, obviously collaboration is key, and there's all different types of levers and things being tried out there. There's things before our Parliament. We just have had just recently, I guess, the autonomous sanctions legislation come in, which is now being used right now, and only came in November or late last year. It's being used. So yeah, it is. It's a tough issue, but I just at the moment, just my attention is just implementing the Transparency Act that's in place in front of me. What else are the levers the government going to pull? Again, that is up to the government, and then whatever levers then they want us to pull, we'll do it. So yeah, sorry if I can't sort of comment on the policy and what's good and bad there really, other than say obviously collaboration is key, and there's things happening, there's things before the Parliament, but as the border force, we'll execute what policy gets put in front of us.
I've got a question for you, Todd, probably on that kind of similar topic. Obviously, reporting on modern slavery is not an easy task, and particularly when we're looking at this kind of phased approach to disengaging with suppliers and whatnot. I'm sure that a lot of the attendees here who are kind of involved from their business perspective in writing that modern slavery statement, it's not necessarily an easy task to kind of start with and continue with. What kind of resources are out there for whether that's from the ABF or broader government bodies in terms of assisting them with writing the modern slavery statement and then also addressing some of these issues?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing is obviously point to our register, but which has some material. But I guess there's just some great civil, I guess, agencies out there now that do, provide there's a business out there and they do this for a living now, provide businesses advice on how to do this, and it's a lot of experienced people out there doing that sort of stuff. Obviously, can't advocate a particular one, but some very experienced, smart people, and some of them got ex-government people in them as well. So I've got that mixture providing that advice. So there are those sorts of organisations. We have our resources on the web, and then it's like for us too with our Commonwealth writing team. We're learning as well who to collaborate with, where to look. I was just on the phone yesterday with the OECD responsible business sort of area, just with them, and I was asking them these exact questions too. Where's sort of the best practice here, and so using so we've got access to a heap of, I guess, online OECD resources yesterday from their responsible business area. So we're doing a lot of searching ourselves, and so I think that the best way to do it is you've got to look at those areas that have been doing it for some of those countries that have been doing this sort of thing for a while, whether it be in due diligence, as well as the modern slavery side of the house. You get some experienced government areas there, and what are they doing? You have international organisations like the OECD, and then you have those civil community or commercial enterprises now that specialise in this, and we have our resource register. But we probably need to update that this year too ourselves. So I really, now that we're learning, we need to see what we can put on there as well. So I think it's an area too where the knowledge and expertise is growing. It was interesting. I've asked a couple of experts recently, like, which governments do best practice in public procurement. I'll be saying that to some of the, commercial entities or OECDs, and they'll often refer to the what they call the Nordic countries. I'll often say, a lot of them have been doing this for a while, or the Norways, the Swedens, have sort of been doing this for a while. If you want to see people do this thing well, or governments do this well, they sort of said that there's good examples there. So we're doing things like that. So we'll try and update our resource point, but it's a growing area. Everybody's learning.
Absolutely, it's definitely developing. Kind of, the modern slavery statement and act is quite new, and it's obviously going to develop more and more as the years go on, and as the process matures. So I can appreciate that for sure.
Yep.
Maybe just a quick question, a bit left field for you, Todd, here as well. I've seen some statements where an organization might have, at a guess, 10 or 15,000 tier 1 suppliers. And their statement is based on, I don't know, engaging with a couple of hundred suppliers and sort of tracking those over time. Is there going to be at any time maybe some kind of KPIs or minimum, this is what you've got to do? You've got to cover, I don't know, 80% of your spend in your statement. Are there any sort of KPIs being considered on that front going forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and we've got like the Australian Institute of Criminology sort of helping us a bit too at the moment. Look at how you assess effectiveness, and I mean, the Act right now is pretty, it doesn't really go into quality that much. That's right. So I guess that's going to be part of the review. Where does it where does it go from here? So and then you've got to make sure you can implement it, and then you've got the resources to implement it. I think when I know every time I've had a brief by those big academic institutions which have done some great reports, I always say to them, so what resources did you put into doing this 40-page report on 100 entities? And some of them is like, we had 9 people full-time for 3 months, and 3 of them had PhDs. So there's it just sort of shows you. And one of them was like 2 years, 12 people type stuff to do this analysis. So you need a lot of staff then to obviously check and police that if you're going to sort of put that sort of stuff in. But you're right, we do need to go to boost quality. But then just what mechanisms can you do to do it? So we don't have it there at the moment. We are looking at it. The review is certainly going to discuss it. So this year the review will discuss that, no doubt. So we'll just see what comes out of the review, and just hope that whatever comes out of the review, they give us enough resources to do it.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Todd. Yeah, I guess it is a challenge. I guess it drives that point home of collaboration as well. James, in a second, I saw your hand raised. Good etiquette here. No, I think collaboration there rears its head as well, because people are resource poor. And just on that matter, we've seen quite a significant growth on the consortium side, which is really good to see that industries are really starting to collaborate in that space. Over to you, James. There we go.
Sorry about that. Had trouble unmuting. Thanks, Nicholas. It's not for me to comment on how the Australian government is going to implement an Australian Act of Parliament, but there are two things that I think are hugely valuable in the way that Australia has implemented the MSA today. One is that it's been relentlessly principled, and it's said that the MSA aligns with international standards to which we're committed, such as the UN Guiding Principles. And the second is that it's been relentlessly pragmatic. And it said, we recognize that we can't go from 0 to 100 immediately. This is going to be a ratchet process. Everybody has, as you heard in Todd's excellent answer, people have scarce resources. We have to be realistic while still being ambitious and pushing forward to meet, those international standards. So in thinking about this question, how do we allocate scarce resources to investigate risk in the supply chain? I think and in our operations, it's crucial to look at best practice internationally, the kinds of materials that Todd was pointing to from the OECD Responsible Business Conduct Unit, for example. And the key answer that's embedded in the guiding principles and the OECD norms is it's a question of salience. So the issue is not how close are you to another firm, how many tiers away from you are they in the supply chain, how long-standing or established is the business relationship. The key question is how salient is the risk that firm poses to people. And salience is a term that means something quite specific in this area. It's about the severity of the risk, it's about the scope of the risk, and it's about how remediable the risk would be if it were realized. Now, there's a big literature out there. There are for-profit and not-for-profit entities in Australia that advise on exactly what that means. But the crucial thing to get across here is if you focus your scarce due diligence resources on those parts of your supply and operations where you're exposed to the most severe risks at the largest scale, like, for example, Xinjiang, then you can have comfort that you are aligning with the international standard, and anybody, whether it's the Australian government or anybody else who's reviewing your practice, is probably pretty likely to give you a big tick for that. So I think that's really crucial to get across to people, that it's about the risks to people drives where the resources need to be allocated, not necessarily the risk to the business. Over.
Totally agree. Thanks, James, for that. Painfully aware that we've just hit the 12:30 mark here. I might just ask Elaine a quick question around the resources. You mentioned some very good resources in line with James's statement as well. Can those be made available to all the attendees? And whilst you've got the mic, what are your last words? What's your takeaway? What would you suggest people do on their journey here in this modern slavery ethical sourcing space?
So in terms of resources, the resources we've developed, we are currently, I think I put a comment in the chat function. We're currently putting together a standalone webpage on our website, and for what it's worth, we'll share as much as we can there. So I've seen a couple of comments about sharing particular resources I mentioned. So keep your eye out on the Benevolent Society website, and we'd be very happy to share what we have there. In terms of any kind of observations or final comments, I would really share the view around salient human rights issues. And we are an organisation that has just undergone that process of identifying salient human rights issues being guided by the UN guiding principles. And I think it's a very good governing framework in terms of identifying where resources need to go. So the Benevolent Society, we are an organisation that meets the threshold for reporting, but we are also one that has scarcity of resources. We face that just as much as probably some others that have joined the core today. So it's predominantly led by the legal team here at the Benevolent Society. The legal team is very small. There's 2 lawyers and 1 paralegal, but it's not we lead it, but it's championed by representatives across the entire organisation. So when we talk about resources, whilst there may be a function that leads it, don't forget, I mean, this is also why we took a view that it has to be embedded in our culture, not just in one single portfolio, one director. Everyone needs to understand this. I mean, it's no good if I'm the only one who understands what the salient human rights issues of the Benevolent Society are. Everyone needs to get involved. And I think because we're a not-for-profit, I think there might be an assumption that, well, that would be easy because, you know, we work in a not-for-profit. That's the nature of what we do, but we all work with people. So reiterating that point, risk to people, that's key to kind of this journey. And I would suggest, you know, we are all, you know, people organisations, so we should be led by that.
Perfect. No, thanks.
You.
Embedded in the organisation and it's a risk to people that is the key driver. Totally agree with you there, Elaine. James, your final comments as well, and then over to you, Todd.
Sorry, still glitches with the software. Good way to end it as we started there. But look, I honestly don't have anything more to add than that. I think that is a really critical step. And it's great to see that the community of practice around these issues is coming to terms with this large cultural transformation that's required here. Yes, this starts from a place about compliance, but this is a really fundamental shift in the way the market understands risk, the way the government regulates risk, and therefore your orientation to risk in the way that you interact with people, with your customers, your clients. I think there's no better way to put that than Elaine did. So just a big congratulations to everybody for getting this far. Still a long way to go, but thank you also to Inform 365 for convening this conversation.
Thank you, James. Over to you, Todd. Final words.
Just final words for me. 2 key points is that collaboration is key. We know we can't do it on our own. You can't sort of abdicate responsibility. That's why I love turning up things like this. So yeah, some of those comments from Elaine and James before, I learn something new every day when I'm here. So you know, I'm learning. We acknowledge that, but you've got to keep collaborating and you know, get those lessons out for other people to learn from, so we can all learn from it. You know, for example, we do have an advisory group made up of business, civil society, and unions and government that advises us on implementing the Act. So that collaboration is there. We've got to keep it going. And just to highlight again, people to people that we are reviewing that Act this year. So when it does come out, if people want to influence where the Act goes, then that's it. You know, get involved. So that's it for me. I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much, everybody.
No, brilliant. I hope everyone agrees that was a smashing session. I think we'll have to extend it to 2 hours next time because we barely scratched the surface of all the great questions that came in. So thanks everyone for attending. I won't keep you any longer. If you've got any questions, you've got the contact details down there. We will be sending out the recording to all registered attendees, but also we'll send out the Q&As that we didn't get onto. So thanks everyone. Take care and stay safe, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thanks.